Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome back. It's a live stream brought to you today following a brief intermission yesterday where I was traveling and celebrating slightly early, well, maybe just about on time, Christmas drinks with comrades down on the other end of the River Mersey, and a fine time was had by all there. So, if my voice is slightly more croakier than normal, it's because I spent yesterday evening shouting to make myself heard. So, good evening to everybody, and let's start off with our customary walk through those who are in the chat. So we've got Jay over there in Norfolk, Virginia. We have Peter residing in Perfidious Albion. We have Yuan joining us from the nation of Jordan, Amman, the capital there. We have Banana Bender who says good morning from the other end of the world. And we have Rob and Barry G, my fellow resident of Manchester. And we have Alex E over there in Wales. And we have Jenny Lynn who says good evening, comrades, with the appropriate Z on the end. So we are getting underway tonight with just a couple of things that I wanted to talk about, which is, first of all, the right, okay, I think that's us back again now. We are back online. So yes, the stream went down there for a second, and I think we've got back up again. Right, so please rejoin if you've dropped out. I'll need to put it back on again. Right, so good evening to Pulgasari, who only doesn't get the chance to watch very often and now gets the buffering. Well, hopefully we're back online everywhere now. So, yes, the internet connection across Britain is usually held together by bits of string. So, here we go. Good evening to Mike, my comrade from the CPGBML, who's checking in. And good evening to Morgan and Luther and everybody else who's joined us. And Jamshi's Fist. Haven't seen you here before, but welcome along. And Dean, good evening to you. So, beginning then with the Putin press conference, ran for 4 hours. and 40 minutes, and was an example of the fact that, well, everything that they, the stories that they put out there across all of the press, in bourgeois press in Britain, about the fact that Putin was riven with cancer, had dementia, had various other interesting diseases, had gone insane, was in a straitjacket, had been replaced by at least 8 doubles, was being played by an actor, was being played by several actors, all of whom looked slightly different. And the funny thing was, of course, Putin played with that by having an AI rendered version of himself pop up in the middle of the speech when he was talking about artificial intelligence, which was rather funny. And of course, it wasn't just journalists' questions he was taking. There was a series of questions from people all the way across Russia addressing him, including questions that were critical of him, which of course was going through all that for 4 hours 40 minutes proves, and being coherent. I mean, I've seen about an hour and a half of it, but apparently, like, he was on the ball all the way through. That's not a man who has mental issues, and it's certainly not a man who struggles with his ability to sustain an argument. So it's certainly the absolute diametric opposite of Joe Biden, of course, who can barely stagger through a 3-minute prepared speech. So Putin, impressive performance. He's always quite impressive in these settings. And the interesting things that he said were really sort of confirmations of what's been speculated about in terms of the Russian government line. He essentially confirmed that Mykolaiv and the Odessa were coming back into the Russian world, shall we say. Putin would argue that they never left it. And confirmed that they are going to go over to the west bank of the Dnieper River, and that this war is essentially going to carry on until they've taken all of what Russians call Novorossiya, which has been speculated about from the very beginning. But you couldn't have got hold of it, of course, without the actions of Joe Biden. So again, like all those Russian nationalists who are agitating for the reclaiming of the traditional Russian lands should really thank Joe Biden and Boris Johnson for this, because the Kremlin leadership were ready to negotiate that away back in April of last year in return for a settlement. Of course, the intransigence of the imperialists is something that Putin and the others had to learn. And this was reflected in something that Putin said when he was asked a sort of bit of a throwaway question, but he answered it interestingly, which is that he was asked, what would you tell the Vladimir Putin of 20 years ago, of the year 2000, when he first became president, when he was first elected president? And he said he would be he wishes that he'd been less naive in dealing with the Western partners. He always calls them Western partners, but even though my Russian isn't particularly good enough to do direct translations, you can hear when he's putting a heavy amount of irony into his voice. And certainly that's the case whenever he refers to the Western partners. So that was interesting. It reflects the evolution of not just Putin, but all of the key leaders in the Kremlin, him, Shoigu, Medvedev, others, who, reflecting the way in which Russian capitalism was, and to a certain extent still is, and before that, reflecting the views of the nomenclatura of the revisionist period, the Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev period, which is that they thought that oil and gas, in particular, was going to be part of their way to secure peace and profitability with particularly the Europeans. And now Putin reflects and says basically that Europe has no independence, that they are completely subservient to US imperialism. He doesn't say US imperialism, he just says the US. But essentially that's what he means. So it's Putin's a great example of somebody who's been forced to learn or unlearn things over the course of his long period in office. And he had to eventually learn the necessary lesson that the US imperialists would not stop until not only he was gone or possibly dead, but that the country was destroyed. And that it didn't matter how many handshakes and personal building of personal good relations between him and a US president, that didn't matter, because as he himself has observed, the system itself remains viscerally hostile. And Putin would have gone through at least some Marxist education as a younger man, so he should be able to put those lessons together, and it seems now that he very much has. Now, so he confirmed that what we very much suspected, that they are going to go all the way down and deprive whatever is left of Ukraine of a coast. Now, this brings us back to the question of whether it is the case that they're going to leave a rump version of Ukraine, and whether that's going to include Kiev. And I'm beginning to strongly suspect that it's not. Also, I now am almost entirely sure that all of the so-called negotiations that the Americans have been posturing about making the Kiev regime engage in, those aren't going to happen. The only thing that's going to be talked about between the Kiev regime when it's taken over by whoever comes next, be it Zelensky or somebody else, the only thing that's going to be talked about is the terms of surrender. That's it. There's going to be no actual negotiation anymore. And this has been almost tacitly acknowledged now by the US imperialists themselves, because they got involved in this political wrangle between the Republicans and the Democrats that reflects not just a sort of a political problem, but a split in the various different factions within the American ruling class. There is one faction that favors the global approach, that is trying to secure or retain as much as they can full spectrum dominance. So retain the presence in West Asia by supporting Israel, retain their presence in Europe by supporting Ukraine. Well, I shouldn't use the term supporting Ukraine, by arming and weaponizing Ukraine, because they're not supporting Ukraine at all. They're destroying it. And of course then building up for the triggering of a war with China, which this faction hopes that the Taiwanese and possibly the Japanese will do the fighting in that war for them. I don't think they want to risk their own military in doing so. So there's that faction. There is another one, I think, which is more concerned with getting this war started with China, and they're concerned about that over and above the war in Ukraine. They're prepared to abandon that. This was something that they are now prepared to jettison Ukraine in order to put all their efforts into triggering this war with China over Taiwan. That's the other faction. Now, there's a bit of overlap between those, obviously. There's a third faction, which is something of a minority view, but it is a view which I think is gaining support in the halls of Congress, but more specifically within the think tank world and within certain minority elements of the ruling class. And this is a group that you hear their demands or wishes every now and again via their media spokespeople. And that is those who are aligned with the likes of Tucker Carlson, with former Colonel Douglas McGregor and others, who are the more, shall we say, more revanchist, shall we say, America First types, the kind of guys who regarded Trump as possibly a good idea but poorly executed. And this minority faction favors more internal repression inside the United States to, quote unquote, get their house in order, but also aggressive moves in what they regard as their hemisphere being prioritized over a potential war with China and over the war in Ukraine. Now, I stress that this is a minority faction, but they are organized and they are pushing quite hard on this idea of it being all about the border. That's where this demand within the Republican Party has come from, with regard to the funding of the border wall. First of all, it's a political stunt to try and basically completely fuck the Democrats by getting them to sign up to, Cheeto Franco's border wall idea. The Democrats won't agree to it because it will be absolute electoral suicide for them to sign up for that. And the other reason why they're pushing it is because this is part of an unfolding strategy that's going on here from this particular faction. They are in favor of going after the government of López Obrador in Mexico. They are in favor of the more aggressive pursuit of regime change operations in places like especially Venezuela, Brazil, other South American nations, which they regard as theirs to control. And this group favors their much more aggressive moves in their hemisphere. They appear to have accepted, at least for now, that the US is too far behind to actually have a real war with China, and they don't see the benefit of a war with Russia for now. This group favors, again, like a reassertion of American power in their hemisphere, which makes them quite dangerous, because their approach is fooling some people that they are somehow anti-war or something. And this is also why Alex Jones has been allowed back on Twitter, by the way. That, and of course he's now spouting loads of pro-Israel shit. But as I have said before, he's been doing that for years. There are those on the sort of libertarian conspiracy theory right in the United States who have always suspected Alex Jones of being dodgy in terms of him being like pro-Israel. And so he was on with Carlson the other day talking all kinds of shit about Hamas and Hezbollah are coming over the border from Mexico. They got sleeper cells, man. They got sleeper cells. That kind of thing. And they're going to start shooting people if a shooting war starts with Iran. It was like complete boilerplate fevered early 2000s fantasies from like Tom Clancy types. And so that's what he's been brought back to do. Clearly, he's been brought back to do pro-imperialist propaganda for somebody inside a particular faction of the ruling class. And I suspect that it's probably the same faction that funds Carlson and is politically aligned broadly around Trump, though they would probably like to find themselves a more reliable figure than Trump. So this combination has brought it to pass that they have basically reached a log jam with regard to the future funding for Ukraine. And there's also clearly a decision been made that Zelensky's day is done. They can't work with him anymore. That's a consensus view, it seems, across various agencies in the United States, which is why when they have decided when they've decided to not go all out and try and get this funding through, it's because that even the Biden regime knows very well that Zelensky is a spent force. Whatever use he might have had for them has long since gone. Now they need to have somebody in there who will do what he's told and open up some kind of negotiation with the Russians. The American imperialists hope that by trying to get them to do that, that the Russians will be forced to make concessions, because the Americans will then say, well, Ukraine has fought the Russians to a standstill. Now all they want is negotiations. They want a negotiated settlement. And the Russians will basically just say, well, fuck you, surrender. And the war will keep going. Much like, essentially, the Taliban did with their negotiations with Trump and then Biden. They kept talking and talking and talking and reaching agreements whilst continuing their advance. right up to the moment when the US pulled out. A similar thing will happen here. The Americans will engineer, and they already are engineering, the removal of Zelensky. Now he's not coming back from the United States with anything in terms of significant funding or weapons shipments. Is like there was some comparatively minimal amount of money in a defense appropriations bill that's passed. I believe it's like 800 million, which in terms of the needs of Ukraine isn't a great deal. And now he's gone to meet with the military men in Germany and one of the US Air Force bases there, and is basically going to be told that, well, yeah, you better go on the defensive and maybe think again about those negotiations. Basically, Zelensky's political capital is exhausted. It's gone. There's nothing left for him to do now, other than get out of the way. So Zelensky finished, killed off by the Americans, by the men who made him. It's just a matter of when, not if now, he departs the scene. Whether he has been told by somebody in the United States, look, Vlad, grab a few million in suitcases and we'll secure for you a dignified exit. So the only question now is who replaces him. There are various sharks in the water in Kiev maneuvering for a bite of the prize. One of them is, of course, Zelensky, and another one who seems to fancy himself for some kind of role, if not president, then some kind of big job, is, of course, Alexei Arestovich, the former spin doctor for Zelensky, who's now turned on him. And he has been, of course, dropping all kinds of truth bombs, shall we say, a bit late now, about his time in office, about the fact that they lied about everything with regard to Ukraine, about the fact that they picked the wrong side and have picked the wrong side for 30 years. You do really think, you have to wonder how the hell they managed to think that the US on the downslope after 2008, having already lost in Iraq, and having already been involved in an unwinnable quagmire in Afghanistan, was going to be a reliable partner for Ukraine. But then again, the people who made those decisions, the Ukrainian oligarchy, didn't really care. All they wanted was another means by which they could loot the country and access more money from overseas, the European Union being the chosen vehicle for doing that. So Arestovich commented upon Putin's press conference today that Putin does a 4.5-hour press conference with critical questions from all over Russia, and he stood in front of a background of blue and yellow. If Zelensky had stood in front of a background of red, white, and blue, they'd have burned him already. So, and Arestovich concludes by saying that, well, who looks like the winner here, or something like that. So, clearly, even people who've been involved in the Ukrainian regime know very well that the end is coming. And now it's just a question of when and how. And I suspect, if I'm going to go into prediction mode for a moment, the Americans will soon engineer the removal of Zelensky somehow or another. They will want it to be smooth. They'll be telling him he has to resign in favor of Zelensky or somebody else, and then that person will have to start the negotiation process. The Russians will say surrender, and will probably give them a moment to think about it. And if the Ukrainian leadership doesn't agree to just surrender on the terms dictated by the Russians, then the Russians will then launch much more serious attacks, and probably starting with an intensified bombing campaign. We should note in passing that it is now said that the Russians have eliminated all of the Patriot missile batteries across Ukraine. They knew where they were, they targeted them, and they blew them all up within 24 hours. So that's Ukraine's air defenses that was slapped together towards the end of last year and beginning of this, severely damaged. So clearly the Russians are planning a significant air campaign, and if they're getting rid of the Patriot batteries, they're going to be probably using their air force as well as cruise missiles, as well as the geranium drones, which of course have now been improved further by from their original Iranian design by the replacing of the propeller engine with a jet engine. So not only have they got more of these now, but they're more dangerous in terms of their ability to go faster. And the drone technology is improving significantly all the time in the Russian Federation. They're now probably the world leaders in it, I would guess. So the Ukrainians are going to be facing a massive and sustained bombing campaign over, the rest of this month, beginning of next month. Maybe the Russians will pause it if some kind of power regime change operation happens in Kiev and some kind of offer of negotiations comes. They will offer the Kiev regime terms, and if the Kiev regime doesn't accept them, then the air raids will intensify, the bombing campaign will intensify, and the Russians, as confirmed by Putin today, will look to cross the Dnieper River onto the West Bank and look then to move on Nikolaev and Odessa. And in passing, I should also mention that today it came out that the Moldovans are clearing the minefields around the area known as Transnistria, or the Prednestorovian Moldavian Republic, the breakaway region of Moldova that's been semi-independent for 30 years, which is, of course, home to about 1,500 Russian peacekeepers and a gigantic munitions dump, which it has been threatened at various stages that there's going to be some kind of second front opened there by either Ukraine, who now probably don't have the men to do it, or by somebody else. The somebody else being the latest Western puppet to thrust themselves boldly into the role left vacant by Zelensky, and that is, of course, the incredible moron Maya Sandu, the leader in inverted commas of Moldova, who has decided that to follow in Zelensky's wake by making herself into a useful idiot of US imperialism. Putin commented on this as well in his press conference when he said that, well, look, if Moldova wants to go out the CIS, they really won't be missed. He's basically very dismissive about the Moldovans, and he's probably right. Moldova doesn't bring a lot to the table for the Russians in the CIS, but they don't want to lose that foothold that they've got there in Prednestrovia. So I imagine that the ultimate plan would be to link up with that as well and take that away. So, it's already gone. Moldova hasn't had control over that area since 1991. It's never been controlled by the Moldovan government since independence from the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there we are. It's crisis time in Kiev. It's heading towards the buffers in a major way. Meanwhile, of course, in the United States, we have the opening of the impeachment inquiry into Biden in the House of Representatives. Now, it is unlikely that Biden is going to get impeached unless, of course, I think even if it turned out that Hunter Biden was taking crack with Igor Kolomoisky and a group of illegally imported prostitutes, and whilst at the same time firing an illegal assault weapon into the air and urinating on a Bible, the Democrats would still refuse to impeach him. And maybe certain leftist podcasts would proclaim that this made Hunter Biden into the coolest man in America. So there's nothing that Biden could do that would make the Democrats in the Senate turn on him. It would be too damaging if they did. So it's very unlikely that this impeachment trial would go anywhere. It would be blocked in the Senate. It's doubtful that even some of the Republican senators would vote for it. So where's it going to go? Well, what they're going to do is they're going to drag this out as long as they can to cause maximum damage to Biden in the election year. That's what it's about. Same tactics that the Democrats used on Trump. The difference being, of course, that if the Republicans want to go all in on this, as some of them do, then they've actually got real stuff to throw at Biden. They've got all the stuff about Burisma, which is real. They've got all the stuff about his shady business dealings with the oligarchs in Ukraine, and that alone would be enough to make a case out of, or at the very least, air all this dirty laundry in public, force Hunter Biden onto the stand in the House of Representatives for an aggressive line of questioning, if they possibly can. Though there is speculation from some legal experts in the United States that this is the reason why they appointed a special prosecutor for Hunter Biden's case. It was to charge him for a series of other crimes, to then make the argument that because he'd been indicted on these various different other crimes in another federal inquiry, that he then couldn't be called in for testimony in the House of Representatives. That's one interpretation I've heard. I don't know how true that is, but it certainly seems like the kind of shady maneuver that they would pull. But the Republicans will want Hunter Biden on the stand. They'll want his former business partner on the stand. They'll want everybody they can possibly get, and as many damning pieces of testimony as they can possibly get out into the public domain as possible. The idea is, of course, that you put all the dirt about Biden, and there's lots to put out there, into the open to bury him in the election year. As it now looks as if, I thought that they would swap out Biden for Newsom or somebody else. It's now looking like they're not even going to manage to do that. And I was surprised that they didn't just call a meeting behind closed doors and say to Biden, hey, Joe, you like trains, right? Go and play with these. And tell Kamala that she's won a tour of gin production facilities in the West Virginia area or something like that, and get her out of the way as well. I always you assume, perhaps wrongly, that the bourgeois do have some way of efficiently running their political operation. They were efficiently able to dispose of Sanders in 2020. Not that he put up much of a fight. And they efficiently installed Biden. But they now are faced with a problem in that they can't seem to get rid of him. I can't believe that American Psycho Newsom doesn't want the job. He's certainly been auditioning for it. But they don't seem to be able to agree amongst themselves what to do. They don't seem to know how to dispose of Biden. I would imagine it would be fairly easy. Just lean on his family and say, well, all the charges go away if old Joe steps down and we get a clean pair of hands in. But apparently they can't do that. They can't seem to get Kamala out of the way, even though I would have thought that would have been fairly easy as well. So these people's operation isn't anything like as efficient as we might suspect. They can't seem to reach an agreement on how to go forward. As Jenny observes in the chat, there was a big move behind, I'm assuming you mean DeSantis there, but DeSantis has proved to be a complete dud. The man is useless, can't campaign, completely unable to even fake like he has some sort of ability to communicate with the voters. You see the guy on the campaign trail, he looks afraid and he looks terrified to actually meet the real people out there. Trump, however, whatever his private opinions are of the voters, he's able to go out there and give it the old thumbs up. Come on, guys, let's go. We're going to make America great again if it kills everybody in it. That kind of thing. He's able to fake his way through these big rallies, and he actually enjoys it, to be honest. Whereas DeSantis just seems weird. And then he's now been outperformed by Tim Scott and Fat Man Christie. So it's over for DeSantis, I think. And now perhaps the Republicans have decided to consolidate themselves. They were thinking that they were going to get behind Nikki Haley as the anti-Trump alternative, but she's been exposed by, of all people, Vivek Ramaswamy, who's just doing a Trump impression. He's just taking all the stuff that Trump did in 2016 and he's just doing it again. So he basically did the same thing to Haley that Trump did to Jeb Bush. If you go back and look at the last Republican debate, Haley was going on about, well, we can't possibly give in to Putin, and Ramaswamy quite clearly saw that this woman is a dim bulb, which she is. She's incredibly stupid. Just seems incredibly dumb, almost as dumb as Kamala. So Ramaswamy says, well, which regions of Ukraine are you talking about here? And she couldn't name any, of course. clearly had done his homework and was ready to name them. And she looked stupid, and he got booed, and he used the same line that Trump used in 2016. He says, when Trump said, that's Jeb's, sorry, I'll do the voice. That's Jeb's special interests they're booing. And I won't do a Vivek Ramaswamy impression because I don't think he's that distinctive. But he used the same line. He says, that's the special interests booing me because I've exposed her. So he's, as you say, Jenny, in the chat, Vivek Ramaswamy's been a much better Trump impersonator because he goes out there and he gives it the whole sort of, he's a blustering con man who knows how to turn a good phrase. He hasn't got any of Trump's vote-winning ability, but he's probably doing enough to damage Haley and the others in the race to probably get offered a big job in Trump's administration. Now, there are, of course, many in the Republican hierarchy who despise Trump and don't want to see him back, but they're going to be faced with the fact that none of their other candidates are worth a shit. Like, Nikki Haley's cardboard and absolutely useless. Tim Scott, Chris Christie? I mean, Chris Christie's an incredibly dirty politician who's not very popular anyway. So they're going to be forced to consolidate behind Trump in the end, the Republicans. No matter how much people like Mitch McConnell and co, if indeed Mitch McConnell even functions anymore, despise him, he's going to be their candidate. He's going to win by a country mile. He's ahead in a lot of the swing states now, so they're going to be forced to consolidate behind him. And the Democrats are going to be running a weakened, obviously mentally impaired, mired in corruption Joe Biden. And it's going to be a disaster. They're going to lose to Trump by a country mile. All of the so-called positives that Biden's people keep talking about Bidenomics. Hey man, we're running Bidenomics. Well, none of that's working. I mean, I will in a future episode, I am going to go into what the GDP measurement means, because there's been some talk about that on the Telegram group, and I think it's worth examining, because GDP as a measurement is designed these days in the way it's calculated, particularly for countries like Britain and the United States, which are heavily financialized and very hollowed out. The GDP measurement is designed to incorporate every single thing that generates a profit. So every so-called service industry that generates nothing positive. So like every time there's like transactions in terms of privatizing assets or something completely parasitic that produces, again, no commodity, it's just money exchanging hands. All of that is recorded as like economic activity and therefore gets put onto the GDP figures. And so when you've got Biden, I mean, Trump did the same thing when he was in office, saying we've got this amazing GDP, the economy is growing again. What's happening is you're recording a lot of financial activity, which isn't actually producing anything. You've got wage rises for American workers, far outstripped, though, by price increases. So there has been real terms pay cuts for the American worker now for a number of years. So people are going into the election worse off, with like a feeling of disillusionment with a despised president and a despised Democratic Party. The Republican Party ain't too popular either, but Trump, of course, is going to win by a country mile. And I think that there will be a certain consolidation behind him. The bits of the ruling class will hate it and scream about it and yell about the death of our democracy, but I don't think that'll make any difference. And if they do try and do some sort of rigging, I don't think that's going to come off either for them. I think Trump's got it. Unless, of course, they find some way to send him to prison or he drops dead in the meantime, in which case, well, say hello to President Vivek Ramaswamy, I think would be probably the best way of looking at it. So it's going to be an absolute festival of disasters in the coming year. American imperialism is plunging into a deep political crisis, which will only be made worse as the situation in Ukraine deteriorates. The situation in Israel has already fatally damaged the Biden regime below the waterline. And you've got the fact that there's persistent talk that the depression is going to turn back into a recession at some point within the next year to 18 months, according to the various analysts in even bourgeois journals. So we're going to be doing a separate episode on the latest economic news pretty soon. So there's one more thing I wanted to mention, which is, of course, the ongoing situation on the front lines in Gaza, which is that, I mean, I'm going to go back into the Israel situation tomorrow night. But what's going on at the moment is, of course, there's increased confirmation of very, very significant casualties with regard to the Israeli army in Gaza itself. As various other people have observed, one of the reasons why the casualty count for officers is so high is it appears that what the Palestinian forces are doing is targeting the Israeli officers every time they get out of their vehicles. They're targeting them for death first, because of course that creates chaos in the command structure of all these Israeli units. It's why so many of them are being targeted. Now, you would think that the Israelis wouldn't need to deploy that many senior officers to the front lines, but apparently they do. So significant casualties, and apparently thousands of severely wounded troops are being constantly evacuated out of Gaza. So for all the horrors that the Israelis are committing, and for all the thousands that they have killed, their army's getting mauled in Gaza. And so now, when you see like Benny Gantz babbling away about how they're going to take the fight to Hezbollah, you can only laugh, because they can't beat the much smaller forces in Gaza. And now they want to go and take on the very well prepared, and even by the accounts of their enemies, very well organized, motivated, and very well led Hezbollah forces, which are now being backed up by other movements inside Lebanon, not just from their base in the Shia population of Lebanon, but from the other sections of the Lebanese population as well. Nasrallah's tactic of calling this a war of liberation appears to be gathering an awful lot of support from other areas that had not been traditionally favorable towards Hezbollah. Their actions against Israel are winning those people over to them. And if the Israelis think that they can force Hezbollah back from the border, well, this didn't work in 2006, and Hezbollah forces are bigger and much better equipped now. So Benny Gantz can sound off all he likes, but even with American backing, this wouldn't be particularly easy to pull off. In fact, it would almost certainly lead to a very embarrassing and disastrous defeat for the Israeli army on the Lebanese border. And I don't think this would split Lebanese society either in the way that they're hoping. It didn't in 2006. And I think it would probably rally the Lebanese population behind Hezbollah and rally them in the cause of completing the liberation of Lebanon. So this isn't something that's going to go well. I think that even the American imperialists will be telling the Israelis that this isn't a very good idea. But with the exchanges of fire getting more intense over the border, thousands and thousands of Israeli settlers having to have been evacuated from the north, the Israelis suffering military reverses in Gaza, the situation for Netanyahu is looking particularly grim. So he and his co-conspirators may just be desperate enough to think that they take a big roll of the dice and launch an attack on Lebanon. So if they do that, then serious times, even more serious times, are upon us indeed. Now, the other front, of course, is the naval front. And the Yemenis are now creating a quite effective, as it turns out, blockade of Israel in the Red Sea, leading the Americans to make all kinds of threats about putting together an anti-piracy force and going after the Yemenis. Well, the Yemenis stood up to everything the Americans threw at them for nearly a decade, so I doubt that they're going to be put off by that. Plus, Iran has made a statement to say that if the Americans think that they're going to essentially fuck around in the Red Sea, then they regard that as a threat to them. So the economic impact of this on the Israeli state is going to grow as the Yemenis forced more and more container ships to either take the long way round, go all the way around the Horn of Africa, or to risk getting taken over and piloted into a Yemeni port, then that's going to start to strangle the Israeli economy. So again, like the National Liberation Fighters of Ansar Allah in Yemen have proven to be incredibly effective, supporting the liberation war in Palestine. So this is all turning incredibly bad for Netanyahu, which is why the Biden regime is desperate to lever him out. They think, and again, this goes back to very early on in mid-October, there's the opinion piece written by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, where he publicly expressed, and he will be speaking, of course, for people within the Biden regime, he publicly expressed that Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, and others had to go, and that somebody else had to be found to run this shit show and put a better face on it. The current regime is too right-wing, too aggressive, too corrupt, too openly and nakedly criminal for the likes of Friedman to be able to spin this to his liberal bourgeois friends, whose children are now all out protesting in the streets about this. It makes for an awkward conversation at dinner. So they want Netanyahu gone. I doubt they have a very viable candidate to replace him. They would have to work with Lapid, Gantz, people who've been in office and have failed enormously, like those two, and Naftali Bennett, when the only really sort of growth sector of the Israeli voting population is, of course, the settler parties typified by Ben-Gvir and others. So the Americans don't have many options, and Netanyahu knows that. So he's not going to back down. He's not going to just quit because they tell him to. He's going to drive a hard bargain here. I think if he is promised immunity from prosecution and is allowed to take his millions and probably retire to Florida, then maybe he'll go, because it's the long shadow of the criminal charges against him which is partially motivating him. There's also the fact that he would end his political career in disgrace and regarded as a failure, which for the man's ego is something that he potentially can't take. But this is going to, of course, be an ongoing story. Needless to say, I will just conclude my remarks on this particular issue by saying that even when confronted with all of the horrors that the Israeli regime is committing, and they are horrors that are brought to your devices from day to day, and you can view all these horrific crimes that the Israeli regime is committing, always bear in mind that they are losing. They are committing enormous barbarities, but they're still losing. The war is going very badly for them. They're now talking about a war in Gaza lasting months. Well, they don't have months. They can't last against the increasing economic damage, the ever-increasing number of casualties coming out of Gaza. They can't win a war in the north against Hezbollah, and if they try to launch one, that really will be game over. So they are losing this. Keep that in mind every day when it gets to, because if you stare at all these images, as many of us do, of like the children who have been killed, the people butchered, the executions in the streets, all of this grisly, murderous stuff that goes on every day, that is the action of a regime that is losing. And not just Netanyahu, but the entire Zionist enterprise is going down the pan. That's why it's doing this. It's most violent and it's most brutal because these are the beginnings of the death throes of this regime. And it might not look like it right now, but the end will come. And it will come within the next, in the end, the full end of the Zionist regime will come within the next decade at least, I think. I think maybe even sooner than that. You already see the settler flows reversing, hundreds of thousands fleeing. And if this war ends as badly as I think it's going to end for them, there'll be very few people want to go there. And if the settler project dies, then the whole thing collapses. Because no one's going to be wanting to go there anymore. It's going to be too toxic to touch. It's going to be an isolated chaotic, corrupt, blood-soaked regime, which is going to start turning in on itself and falling apart. So keep this in mind when looking at the horrors, because this is what a dying colonial state does when it's on its last legs. Right, so let's catch up with the comments. So Mike asks, can statues be raised ironically? I think you've got to find... I think if there's going to be a statue of Biden in Russia, which there should be, I mean, he is the man who did an awful lot for Russian national liberation. They should probably do a humorous one. Get a sculptor in who can sculpt Biden falling down some stairs. Put that up in the middle of Moscow. People will flock to see it. Greetings to Michael in London, Ontario. Darrell Davis says, Russia was led to believe in the 80s that Russia could exist in a dignified way and be on good terms with the West. The Soviet saga teaches us that some are experiential. Some can simply be told that the capitalist world is bollocks. Some need to experience it. Those that are holistically viable will return. Some believe that the Lend-Lease policy leaves them a debt. The USSR paid to use American weapons, thus getting it out of a depression, and Russia is to bow and be thankful. Well, I think Lend-Lease, we've discussed this before, it's massively overstated by the US just how useful that was. And of course, it wasn't just a gift. The Soviets had to pay that back. So, I think that the Soviet leadership from the 50s onwards came to believe that they just made enough concessions to the imperialists that the imperialists would leave them alone. Stalin, of course, never believed that for a second. And Lenin before him didn't believe it either. They saw that you might need to make temporary concessions in a weakened position, or periodically reach an accommodation now and then. But what happened was that the Khrushchevite revisionists took that and turned it into their whole policy, which is that they would just make endless concessions and hope that the imperialists would allow them to coexist in the world. That's why, of course, all of the Soviet bloc countries in the east of Europe all joined the International Monetary Fund in the late 60s and got into debt with it. So by the time you reach the 1980s, the imperialists already had a gigantic amount of debt to hang around the necks of the people's democracies in the East. So it's a tremendously disastrous approach that Soviet leaders took. I think many in the Soviet Union never believed that there would be friendship with the United States for a second. But the corrupted revisionist leadership thought that it was, and the capitalist class that grew out of them believed that it could be. And then they had to be literally kicked in the nuts for 20 years till they finally realized that it wasn't going to happen. So they finally realized that, oh no, there's nothing that we can say or do to stop this other than win militarily in Ukraine and secure ourselves that way. So, evening to Munis. Jenny says, you can tell when they got to Alex Jones too, because way back in the day he used to talk against Israel. Oh, right, okay. So, yeah, maybe that's the offer. Go full Zionist and we'll let you back on the air, Alex. Unused sub said, it's unrealistic to think that Ukraine could be a member of the EU. Well, that's true. They're not going to be a member of the EU. I mean, these accession talks, I mean, naming Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine as candidate EU countries, that's a mark of just massive delusion. Because you are not going to be able to put what's left of Ukraine. If the Russians leave some sort of rump state in the West, the EU is not actually going to put them in, because that would be like then the EU would have to be responsible for a chaotic, violent mess of a regime run by the leftover Banderists. And it would cost them an enormous amount of money and would bring them nothing. Unless, of course, the Americans are ordering them to put Ukraine in the EU and rebuild it, or what's left of Ukraine. But no, it's a joke. But again, this is propaganda we're dealing with, not reality. Banana Bender says, if the eastern Ukrainian regions are already Russian, what would happen for Russia from a formal victory? What comes afterwards? Well, that's an excellent question. the whole question of what comes afterwards depends upon where they draw the line. If they go and take over the entire coastal region, and maybe leave it at that, because then if they've got the coast, then whatever is left of Ukraine can be fairly easily controlled. Because without a coast, Ukraine loses its ability to trade, or a significant amount of its ability to trade. So they can control it that way. But then there's the question of what happens with Kiev, which many in the Russian leadership are saying is a historic Russian city. Do they then draw the boundary at the old line of the old Tsarist Empire? Possibly. And just declare at a certain point that, well, we're done. This is where our border lies. You can have Lvov, which is what I suspect they're going to end up with. I suspect that what they will leave enough of a rump Ukraine in the far west around Lvov, old Galicia, to cause problems for the Poles in particular, but also, of course, the Germans and the Americans. And it'll be enough to cause problems and too little to do anything with regard to the American imperialists. So that's what I think that they will do. They will draw the line where the borders of the old Tsarist Empire were. They'll incorporate Prednestrovia and most of what's now Ukraine, and they'll leave the EU a basket case of a state around Lvov to deal with. Right. Good evening to Klavek. And what else have we got here? Yes, I'm so not surprised that you had to get off Twitter, Jenny. It's a parade of horrors. But I believe that I am correct about this, that this is the beginnings of the death flailings of the Zionist regime. Dean says, David Cameron's statement telling Israel to discipline its extremist settlers shows a realization in the West that Israel is more fragile than force and some kind of political renewal is needed. Yeah, and also Cameron is now trying to appease even conservatives, Conservative Party members, some, a minority, are getting restive about the actions of Israel. So he's got to show that he's doing something. But it's too late. I mean, they've realized that the settlers are a destabilizing force, but without a continually expanding settler population, what does Israel have? You know, Israel cannot just switch off being a settler colonial state. It's in its very nature. It has to expand. It has to take more land. And its entire purpose was to create violence and disorder in the Middle East. And that's remained its purpose. And so if it's not doing that anymore, it'll fall apart and turn in on itself, which is why they never insisted upon the Oslo Accords, even pathetic though they were, being followed. It's why they never did anything that would undermine the integrity and the ability of the Israeli state to act as their garrison state in the West Asian region. So Cameron has had to come out and say this because he's realized that this is going badly in terms of image, in terms of selling Israel and selling the backing of Israel. But it's not going to do any good. It's too late. If they had insisted on the Oslo Accords being followed through to the conclusion, which was going to be the building of a Palestinian state, then that wouldn't have worked for them either, because that would have been probably the death knell for Israel 20 years ago. Because a viable Palestinian state being set up was, according to the tactics pursued by the PLO at the time, meant to be an intermediary phase. Once you got even in a limited version of a right of return, even a small-scale Palestinian state covering 25% of the historic land of Palestine or something like that, even that would have caused a crisis in the Israeli state, which no Israeli government could have withstood, because it would have caused a political crisis, and the integrity of the state would have been called into question. And if they stop the settlements, if they stop the importation of these lunatics largely from the United States, and stop them evicting Palestinians and killing them and doing what they're doing on the West Bank, then Israel has no purpose anymore. All of its internal contradictions will explode. And so the people who run Israel know that. The US imperialists know that. But now they're stuck. because Israel is going to have defeats inflicted upon it, and the state, its status as the garrison in the of the Americans in the region is going to fall apart. The state is going to fall apart. So whatever they do to try and dress this up now, I mean, it's the same reason why Cameron's made this statement, is the same reason they want to get rid of Netanyahu, because they think that, well, if we get rid of him, then we can put a new gloss of paint on this thing and the protests will stop. But it's too late. This particular cat is all the way out of the bag, and there's nothing that's going to put it back in again. Right, I'm going to leave it there tonight, and I'll be back again with you at the same time tomorrow. Thank you to everybody for tuning in and bearing with us through the distinctly ropey internet connection here. Thanks to everybody who's contributed to the chat, and again, see you again tomorrow at 10 p.m. and I will leave you with some popular music.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.